Imagine a world where your very existence, legally speaking, simply vanished. A world where your dreams, your hard-earned savings, even your own children, could be swept away from your control with barely a whisper of protest allowed. What if the year was 1415 and you were a woman about to marry? What legal traps lay waiting, ready to snatch away your autonomy and independence the moment you said, "I do"? Number 7. The utter erasure of her legal self, coverture's iron grip. Step into the year 1415, and the legal landscape for women, particularly married women, was a maze of rules designed to solidify the power of men and the structure of patriarchal society. At the very core of these limitations, the concept that truly shaped a married woman's life was something called coverture. This was not merely a social custom or a polite suggestion. It was the fundamental legal principle of English common law that governed marriage. To truly grasp the extent of its impact, one must understand that coverture meant that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was quite literally subsumed, absorbed, and merged into that of her husband. She ceased to exist as an independent legal person in the eyes of the law. Think of it like this: before she married, a woman was a distinct individual, capable of owning property, making contracts, and perhaps even suing or being sued, assuming she was of age and not under the authority of a guardian or father. The moment the marriage vows were exchanged, she became, in legal terms, feme covert, or a covered woman. Her husband, the feme soul, became her legal representative, her voice, her very public identity. This principle was not born out of sudden malice in 1415. It was a deeply ingrained system that had evolved over centuries, rooted in feudal traditions and reinforced by religious and societal beliefs about the natural order of things. Common law held that husband and wife were one person in law, but crucially, that one person was the husband. He was the head of the household, the master of the family, and the legal entity through whom all family business was conducted. This concept was not just a theoretical point for legal scholars to debate in dusty texts. It had profoundly real and tangible consequences for everyday women. For instance, if a woman owned land before her marriage, perhaps inherited from her parents, or through a previous marriage if she was a widow, that land immediately came under her husband's control upon their union. He could manage it, collect its rents, and benefit from its produce. While he generally could not sell it outright without her formal consent, a process that required a specific legal ritual called a fine, which involved her separate examination to ensure no coercion, he held the reins during their marriage. This created an immediate shift in power dynamics, stripping her of direct economic agency over assets that were once hers. The ramifications of coverture extended far beyond mere property management. Because a married woman lacked a separate legal identity, she could not enter into contracts on her own. Imagine a skilled weaver, before marriage, selling her textiles directly to merchants, negotiating prices, and signing agreements for commissions. Day after her wedding, she could no longer legally do any of that without her husband's explicit permission or involvement. If she made a deal, it was not legally binding upon her. It was binding upon her husband, or rather, not binding at all if he chose to disavow it. This meant that for women who had a trade or a small business, marriage often brought an end to their independent commercial activity, forcing them to rely entirely on their husband's approval for any economic endeavor. This dependence was not a matter of choice, it was a legal imposition. A woman could not borrow money in her own name, nor could she be held personally responsible for debts. Any debts incurred by her, even for things she genuinely needed, ultimately fell to her husband to repay. This system, while seemingly protective of the woman by shielding her from direct liability, simultaneously made her utterly dependent and legally powerless in the financial world. Furthermore, a married woman could not sue or be sued in her own name. If she suffered a wrong, say, someone trespassed on her land or slandered her reputation, it was her husband who had to bring the case to court. He was the plaintiff, acting on her behalf. Similarly, if someone wished to sue her for something she had allegedly done before her marriage, or for an action that was considered her responsibility during the marriage, the lawsuit had to be directed at her husband. This meant that her grievances and her actions were always filtered through her husband's legal persona. It was a clear demonstration that her voice in the legal arena was entirely silenced, absorbed into his. The notion of a woman standing independently before a judge, asserting her rights or defending her actions, was, under the rules of coverture, an impossibility. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a complete stripping of her legal agency, reducing her to a perpetual minor in the eyes of the law, always requiring a male guardian to represent her interests. Consider the practical implications of such a system within a community. A wife could not make a will for her own property without her husband's permission and likely his assistance, as her property was already under his control. If she died intestate without a will, her personal property generally passed to her husband anyway. This meant that even her personal possessions, items she might have cherished or worked hard to acquire, were not truly hers to bequeath freely. Her ability to provide for her family, or to leave specific legacies to friends or charities, was severely curtailed by the legal framework that prioritized her husband's control over everything within the marital union. The intention of coverture, from the perspective of its proponents, was to maintain order, ensure family stability, and simplify legal proceedings by having one clear head of the household. However, the lived reality for wives was a profound and systemic disempowerment, forcing them into a state of legal dependency that left them vulnerable to their husband's decisions and actions, even if those decisions were against their best interests. The system of coverture was so pervasive that it even influenced the way married couples were referred to in legal documents. They were not two separate individuals entering into an agreement. They were often referred to as husband and wife, with the understanding that the husband represented the singular legal entity. This legal oneness was not an equal partnership where both identities merged into a new, shared one. Instead, it was an absorption where the woman's identity effectively ceased to be recognized as distinct. It was a foundational legal disadvantage that permeated every aspect of a married woman's life in 1415, ensuring that her agency, her property, and her very voice in the public sphere were held hostage to the will and legal standing of her husband. There were no immediate remedies or appeals against this fundamental legal position. It was the law of the land, an inescapable condition of marriage for women of all social standings, from the humblest peasant to the highest noblewoman. While some noblewomen might have had their families arrange for certain property to be held in trust for them, or for specific allowances to be made, these were exceptions to the general rule of coverture and required complex legal maneuvers, often initiated by their fathers or male relatives before marriage, not by the women themselves. For the vast majority of women, coverture was an iron cage, solidifying their legal dependence and erasing their independent self. Number 6, a hand without property. What was hers became his. Imagine spending years building a modest collection of valuable items, perhaps inherited silver spoons, a chest full of fine linen, or even a small sum of coins saved from diligent work. Now, picture yourself getting married in 1415. The moment the ceremony concludes, those personal treasures, once unequivocally yours, legally transform, becoming part of your husband's dominion. This wasn't just a social custom or a matter of shared possessions. It was a harsh legal reality under the common law of the time, directly flowing from the principle of coverture. A married woman, or feme covert, had virtually no independent right to own or control property, whether it was real estate, meaning land and buildings, or personal property, which included money, goods, and chattels. What was hers before marriage largely became his upon marriage. Let's delve into the specifics of real estate. If a woman inherited land or was given it as a gift before her marriage, or if she owned land as a widow from a previous marriage, this property, known as her freehold estate, passed into her husband's control and management the moment they were wed. He acquired what was called an estate by marital right, which granted him the right to possess and control her land during their joint lives. He could collect all rents, manage its cultivation, make improvements, and benefit from its produce. While he could not sell the land outright without her specific formal consent, a process that required a complex legal procedure known as a fine or levying a fine, where she was separately interviewed by a judge to ensure her agreement was voluntary and not coerced, he effectively held all the operational power over it. This meant that a woman could witness her ancestral lands, or the fields she once oversaw, being managed in ways she did not approve of, without any real legal recourse to intervene. Connection to the land became secondary to her husband's immediate financial interest. Even if the land eventually reverted to her heirs upon her husband's death, her direct control during her marriage was almost non-existent. Now consider personal property, which encompassed everything else: money, jewelry, clothing, household goods, even livestock. The legal rules regarding these items were even more stark. Upon marriage, all of a wife's personal property, both that she owned before marriage and any she acquired during it, immediately became her husband's absolute possession. There was no distinction: her gold coins, her best dress, the livestock she brought as part of her dowry, all of it transferred ownership to him. Sell it, spend it, give it away, or dispose of it as he saw fit, without needing her consent or even her knowledge. This was a complete absorption of her economic independence. Imagine a woman who was a skilled lacemaker, painstakingly saving her earnings from years of intricate work. The day she married, those savings, her tools, her supplies, her finished lace, all legally became her husband's to command. He could decide to sell her tools, forbidding her from continuing her trade, or he could simply spend her savings on his own ventures or whims, leaving her with nothing of her own. She had no legal standing to prevent this or demand an accounting. The concept of a dowry, or marriage portion, also played a significant role here, though it was not a right in the modern sense of a wife's separate property. Dowry was typically the property, money, or goods that a woman's family gave to her husband upon their marriage. It was intended to establish the new household and often served as a form of prepayment for the wife's future maintenance. However, once the dowry was transferred, it became the husband's property under the principles described above. He could use it as he wished, and the wife had no legal claim over its management or disposal. This meant that the wealth her family invested in her marriage was entirely outside her control once the knot was tied, solidifying her husband's economic standing rather than her own. There was a partial, but often limited, exception to this complete lack of property rights known as dower. This was the right of a widow to inherit a life interest in 1/3 of the freehold lands that her husband owned during their marriage and from which he could have endowed. This was a crucial provision for a widow's survival, ensuring she had some means of support after her husband's death. However, it was a right that only materialized upon widowhood, not during the marriage. During her husband's lifetime, she had no direct control over those lands. Furthermore, dower did not apply to personal property, and it could sometimes be circumvented by clever legal arrangements made by the husband, such as through the use of trusts or specific clauses in his will. If a man chose to create a jointure for his wife, which was an agreement to provide her with a specific income or estate upon his death in lieu of dower, she would be bound by that agreement, and her dower right would be extinguished. While jointures were sometimes more generous than dower, they still served as a contractual arrangement made by the husband, rather than an inherent property right of the wife. Imagine the economic vulnerability this system created. A woman with wealth or a successful trade before marriage found herself entirely divested of her independent financial standing. Economic security became entirely tied to her husband's financial acumen, his generosity, or his very life. If he squandered her fortune or fell into debt, she had no independent resources to fall back upon. If he died, her economic situation was often precarious, relying on dower, which might be insufficient, or on specific provisions in his will, which he could change at any time. This complete absorption of her property and economic identity ensured that a wife remained economically dependent on her husband throughout their marriage, a fundamental disadvantage that shaped her daily existence and limited her choices. It wasn't about partnership or shared responsibility in the modern sense. It was about control and legal ownership by the husband. Number 5, the legal chains on her voice, speaking and acting in court. Picture yourself living in 1415, and a merchant unfairly shortchanges you on a purchase, or a neighbor's livestock tramples your small garden. What would you do? For a single woman, a widow, or a woman who had never married, the path was clear, albeit often challenging. She could, in theory, take her grievance to the local court. She could instruct an attorney, present her case, and seek justice. For a married woman, the legal landscape was entirely different, a testament to the pervasive influence of coverture. Under the common law of the time, a wife could not sue or be sued in her own name. Her voice in the halls of justice, her ability to seek redress for wrongs committed against her, or to defend herself against accusations, was legally silenced. Her husband was, by law, her sole legal representative. This meant that if a wrong was committed against a married woman, such as defamation, assault, or trespass on her property, it was her husband who had to initiate the legal proceedings. The lawsuit would be filed in his name, or sometimes in the names of husband and wife, but he was the primary legal actor. He controlled the pace of the suit, the arguments presented, and whether or not to pursue it at all. Imagine a situation where a woman's reputation was unfairly tarnished by a malicious rumor. She might feel deeply wronged and desperate to clear her name. However, she could not simply walk into court and file a slander suit. She would have to convince her husband to do so. If he believed the matter was trivial, or if he felt it would be too costly, time-consuming, or embarrassing, he could refuse to pursue it. Her sense of injustice, her desire for vindication, would be entirely at his discretion, leaving her without a legal avenue to defend her honor. The same principle applied in reverse. A wife could not be sued in her own name. A creditor wished to recover a debt that a woman had incurred before her marriage, or if someone believed she was responsible for an injury or damage, the lawsuit had to be brought against her husband. He would be the one legally compelled to appear in court, to answer the charges, and to pay any damages awarded. This arrangement, while seemingly offering a shield to the wife, simultaneously stripped her of any individual accountability or legal agency. It meant that any contracts she attempted to make on her own were generally considered void or voidable, as she lacked the legal capacity to enter into them. For example, if a married woman attempted to purchase goods on credit from a merchant, the merchant would be taking a significant risk. If her husband refused to pay, the merchant had no recourse against her personally, only against the husband. This legal reality made it incredibly difficult for married women to engage independently in trade or commerce, further entrenching their economic dependence on their husbands. Consider the complexity this created for legal processes. If a woman had inherited land, and there was a dispute over its boundaries, the lawsuit would be between her husband and the other party, even though the land technically belonged to her lineage. She might attend the court, perhaps even offer testimony, but her presence was as a witness, not as a principal party. The legal decisions made, the agreements reached, or the judgments rendered would all be directed at her husband, binding him. Her interests were presumed to be identical to his, or at the very least, subservient to his. This presumption was deeply problematic when their interests diverged, which was not an uncommon occurrence. A husband might prioritize short-term financial gain from a lawsuit, while his wife might prioritize preserving her ancestral land or avoiding public scrutiny. Yet her preferences held no legal weight compared to his. There were a few, very limited exceptions to this general rule, often involving specific types of ecclesiastical courts or extraordinary circumstances. For instance, in some cases, a wife might be able to bring a suit against her husband in an ecclesiastical court for marital misconduct, such as cruelty or adultery, but these were typically for separation from bed and board, not for a full dissolution of the marriage, and they did not grant her broader legal agency in other matters. In the common law courts, which dealt with most property and civil disputes, the rule was unyielding. The only scenario where a married woman could arguably act independently was if her husband was abroad for an extended period, or if he was legally considered civilly dead, perhaps exiled or declared an outlaw. In such rare instances, she might be treated as a feme soul for the duration of his absence, allowing her to engage in some legal transactions or sue for her necessity. However, these were not typical circumstances and did not negate the general rule that applied to the vast majority of wives. The inability to speak and act in court was more than just a procedural hurdle. It was a profound symbol of a married woman's subjugated legal status. Her lack of a legal voice meant she could not independently protect her reputation, defend her rights, or enforce contracts. It left her vulnerable to the actions of others and entirely dependent on her husband's willingness and ability to represent her interests. This disadvantage underscored the legal fiction that she was not a distinct individual, but rather an extension of her husband, a legal shadow existing only through his legal person. This state of affairs fundamentally limited her ability to participate in the public sphere, to assert her autonomy, or to seek justice on her own terms, cementing her position as a legally dependent entity in 1415. Number 4. No escape, no freedom, the unbreakable bonds of marriage. Imagine a situation where your marriage, intended to be a lifelong partnership, has become an unbearable burden. Perhaps your spouse is cruel or has abandoned you, or has squandered all your family's resources. In 1415, for a woman, the legal avenues for escape from such a marriage were so narrow as to be practically non-existent. Divorce, as we understand it today, the legal dissolution of a marriage allowing both parties to remarry, simply did not exist under English law. The Church, which held immense sway over marital matters, viewed marriage as a sacred, indissoluble sacrament, a lifelong covenant between a man and a woman. This theological stance was mirrored in the legal system, meaning that once the vows were spoken, they were, for all intents and purposes, binding until death. The closest thing to a divorce in 1415 was an annulment, also known as a divorce of vinculo matrimoniae, meaning from the bonds of matrimony. However, annulments were not granted lightly, or for reasons of incompatibility or unhappiness. They were only permissible if it could be proven that the marriage was never valid in the first place due to some fundamental impediment. These impediments were strict and limited. Examples included one party being already married to someone else, bigamy, or the discovery of a pre-existing close blood relationship, consanguinity, or relationship by marriage, affinity, between the couple that violated church law. Impotence on the part of the husband, making the marriage incapable of procreation, was another rare ground, but it was incredibly difficult to prove and often involved intrusive examinations. The process for obtaining an annulment was arduous, costly, and public. It required petitions to the ecclesiastical courts, presentation of evidence, and often lengthy investigations. For most women, particularly those of lower social standing, initiating such a complex legal battle was utterly beyond their means and knowledge. Even if an annulment was successfully granted, it did not reflect negatively on the woman. Instead, it declared that the marriage had never legally existed, rendering any children born from the union illegitimate, a significant social stigma. This legal voiding of the marriage, while allowing both parties to potentially remarry, was a declaration of nullity from the outset, not a termination of an existing union. Far more common, though still difficult, was a divorce a mensa et thoro, which translates to from bed and board. This was not a true divorce but a legal separation. It allowed a husband and wife to live apart, but the marital bond remained unbroken. Neither party was permitted to remarry. Grounds for such a separation were typically extreme cruelty or adultery, proven to the satisfaction of the ecclesiastical courts. Again, the process was expensive and public, requiring considerable evidence and witnesses. If a woman sought this separation, she would have to meticulously document instances of her husband's cruelty, which could involve physical abuse or his infidelity, which was often harder to prove convincingly. Even if she succeeded, she remained legally married. This meant she could not inherit from another man if she found a new partner, nor could she be legally protected as his wife. The economic situation after such a separation was often dire, as her husband was not always legally compelled to provide for her, and she had no legal standing to earn and keep her own money due to coverture. Imagine a woman trapped in an abusive marriage. Her husband might physically harm her, or be a drunkard who squandered their modest livelihood. Her options were brutally few. She could attempt to endure it, hoping for a change or for her husband's death. She could flee, but this would make her a vagrant, without legal protection or means of support, socially ostracized, and subject to laws against vagrancy. Or if she had the means and the courage, she could attempt a divorce a mensa et thoro, which would at best allow her to live separately, perhaps returning to her family if they would take her in, but still tied to a man she detested, unable to seek comfort or companionship in another legal union. Her legal bond to him remained an unbreakable chain, often leaving her in a state of perpetual limbo. The legal inability to dissolve a marriage had profound implications for women's lives and their future security. If a husband abandoned his wife, she remained legally bound to him. She could not remarry to find a new source of support or companionship. Children would remain legally his, and she would have no automatic claim to her own property, which was still under his legal control even in his absence. This left many women in a state of utter desperation, legally tethered to a non-existent or harmful relationship, unable to forge a new path for themselves. For men, while the constraints were technically similar, the social consequences of separation or abandonment were far less severe, and their control over property remained largely intact. They could, and often did, simply take up with another woman without legal repercussions as severe as those faced by women. The enduring nature of the marital bond in 1415, enforced by both church and common law, left wives with virtually no escape hatch from unhappy or dangerous unions. It was a profound disadvantage that contributed significantly to their overall vulnerability and limited their autonomy, forcing many to endure circumstances that would be considered intolerable by modern standards, all because the law refused to acknowledge a way out. Number 3, her body, his will, control over her person and labor. In the year 1415, when a woman spoke her marriage vows, she was not just entering a social contract. She was legally transferring significant control over her very person, her body, and her capacity for work to her husband. This was not a matter of shared decision-making or mutual consent in the modern sense. It was a legal reality where the husband held considerable authority over his wife, a concept deeply rooted in the hierarchical social structures of the time and reinforced by religious doctrines that positioned the husband as the head of the household. This legal disadvantage meant that a wife's autonomy over her own physical self and her economic output was severely curtailed, if not entirely extinguished. One of the most striking aspects of this control was the husband's marital right to his wife's conjugal services. While this was a reciprocal duty, the legal and social power dynamic meant that the husband's right was paramount. A wife's refusal could be seen as a breach of her marital duty, and while the law did not prescribe physical enforcement in this intimate sphere, the social and legal framework implied her obligation. More broadly, the husband had the legal right to determine his wife's residence. She was expected to live with him in his home and follow him wherever he chose to reside. If she left without his permission, she could be compelled to return, and anyone harboring her could face legal consequences. This legal expectation severely restricted her physical freedom and her ability to make independent choices about where and how she lived. She could not simply choose to live elsewhere, even if her marriage was miserable, without facing severe social and legal repercussions, including being considered a runaway and potentially losing any claim to maintenance or support. Furthermore, the husband had the right to exercise moderate correction over his wife. This was a concept inherited from older legal traditions, suggesting that a husband could physically chastise his wife to maintain order within the household. While the specific interpretations of moderate, varied, and truly brutal violence was theoretically condemned, the law provided a significant loophole for a husband to assert physical dominance. There were few legal remedies for a wife suffering from domestic violence unless the abuse was exceptionally severe, threatened her life, or inflicted permanent injury, making it a matter for the ecclesiastical courts to consider for a separation from bed and board. For regular beatings, a wife had little legal recourse. The prevailing social view was that this was a private family matter, and the husband's authority was to be respected. This legal allowance for physical correction left women extremely vulnerable within their own homes, where the very person meant to protect them was legally entitled to inflict harm. Beyond her body, a wife's capacity for labor and any earnings derived from it also legally belonged to her husband. In a society where many women contributed significantly to the household economy, either through agricultural work, craft production, or domestic service, this was a massive disadvantage. Imagine a woman who was a highly skilled spinner, producing fine yarn that was then sold to weavers. Every coin earned from the sale of that yarn, every piece of thread she created, legally belonged to her husband. He could take it, spend it, or invest it as he saw fit, without any requirement to consult her or even inform her. She had no independent claim to the fruits of her own labor. This also applied to women who worked as servants, ale brewers, or in any other trade. Their wages, by law, were their husband's property. This meant that a woman could work tirelessly from dawn till dusk, contributing significantly to the family's survival and prosperity, yet she had no legal control over the money she generated. Economic contribution was absorbed into her husband's legal estate, further cementing her financial dependence and limiting her ability to save, invest, or spend independently. This legal arrangement was not just about control. It was about preventing a wife from establishing any form of independent economic power that might challenge her husband's authority. If she could earn and retain her own money, she might gain a degree of financial autonomy that was incompatible with the prevailing legal understanding of coverture. By ensuring that all her earnings belonged to him, the law reinforced her subservient position within the marital union and the wider society. It also meant that any disputes over money or property acquired through her labor would be settled in favor of her husband, as he was the legal owner. In essence, a wife in 1415 was legally bound to her husband in body and in labor. Physical presence, her intimate life, her residence, and the economic value of her work were all subject to his legal authority and disposition. This was not a partnership of equals, but a relationship defined by the husband's legal dominion, leaving the wife with minimal autonomy over her own existence and economic output. This profound lack of control over her own person and earnings was a constant, daily disadvantage, shaping her life and opportunities in fundamental ways, and contributing significantly to her overall dependence within the medieval legal framework. Number 2, the next generation, a mother's lack of legal claim to her own children. In the year 1415, if you were a mother, the fierce, protective love you felt for your children was, of course, boundless and natural. However, when it came to legal rights, your position was starkly limited, almost to the point of non-existence. Under English common law, the father had almost absolute legal authority and control over the children of the marriage. This meant that a mother, even the one who carried the child and gave birth, had virtually no independent legal claim to her own offspring. This legal disadvantage stripped mothers of their ability to make critical decisions about their children's upbringing, education, and future, placing these matters entirely within the father's purview. This patriarchal control stemmed from the same principles of coverture and the husband's status as the head of the household. Children of the marriage were legally considered his, part of his lineage, and under his dominion. This had numerous profound implications. For example, if a husband and wife separated, even informally or through a divorce mensa et thoro, the children almost invariably remained with the father. A mother could not legally demand custody of her children, regardless of their age, unless the father was proven to be utterly unfit, a bar so high as to be practically insurmountable for most women. Imagine a mother fleeing an abusive marriage, desperate to take her young children with her to ensure their safety. Legally, she had no right to do so. If she took them, her husband could demand their return, and the law would be on his side. She would be seen as abducting his children, not protecting her own. This left many mothers in an agonizing dilemma: endure a difficult or dangerous marriage, or leave and likely lose access to their children. Father's authority extended to every aspect of the children's lives. He decided where they lived, what kind of education they received, if any, and crucially, their future marriages. Daughters who were often married off for strategic alliances or financial gain, the mother's wishes or concerns held no legal sway if they conflicted with the father's plans. She could arrange a marriage for a minor child without the mother's consent, and she had no legal standing to object, even if she believed the match was detrimental to her child's happiness or well-being. Her role in these critical life decisions was advisory at best and legally unenforceable. The same applied to sons. Their apprenticeships, their entry into the church, or their inheritance prospects were all decisions made by the father. This legal reality was particularly harsh for mothers who were widowed. While a widow gained a certain degree of legal independence upon her husband's death, her rights over her children were still limited. The deceased husband could appoint guardians for his minor children through his will, and these guardians, often male relatives or friends, would then have legal control over the children's upbringing and estates, not the mother. While a mother might often be appointed as a guardian if the children were very young, especially if there was no suitable male relative, this was not an automatic right, and her guardianship was often overseen by other male figures or the courts. Even as a guardian, her decisions might be subject to the approval of other male kin or the local lord, depending on the children's inheritance and status. This meant that even after her husband's death, a mother might not have full, independent control over her children's lives or their inherited property, which was usually held in trust for them. Consider the emotional toll this legal framework must have exacted. A mother who nurtured, raised, and cared for her children daily was legally relegated to a secondary role in their lives. Her maternal bond, while socially recognized, was not given legal weight equivalent to the father's paternal authority. This left her vulnerable to her husband's decisions, however misguided or cruel they might be, with no legal avenue to protect her children's interests independently. She was simply a caregiver, not a legal decision maker. This profound lack of legal claim to her own children was a deeply personal and emotionally devastating disadvantage for wives in 1415, ensuring that even in the most intimate of family relationships, their autonomy was legally suppressed. It highlights how thoroughly the legal system was designed to uphold the patriarchal structure of society, extending the husband's dominion even over the next generation. Number 1. The shadow of inheritance, her future tied to the grave. Imagine spending your life in a household, managing its affairs, raising children, and contributing to its prosperity, only for your future economic security to hang precariously on the will and whims of your husband and the complex rules of medieval inheritance. In 1415, a wife's prospects for a secure future, especially after her husband's death, were fraught with legal limitations and uncertainties. While the law provided for some protection through dower, this was often a limited and insufficient provision, and her ability to inherit or control property from her own lineage was often complicated by her married status. This legal disadvantage meant that many women faced a precarious economic existence upon widowhood, with their security fundamentally dependent on male relatives or the generosity of their late husbands. Let's revisit dower, which was arguably the most significant legal right a widow possessed. As mentioned before, dower granted a widow a life interest in 1/3 of the freehold land that her husband owned outright, from which he could have endowed her at any point during their marriage. This meant she could live on the land, cultivate it, or collect rents from it for the remainder of her life. Upon her death, the land would revert to her husband's heirs. While seemingly a protective measure, dower had significant limitations. Firstly, it only applied to freehold land, not to personal property like money, goods, or chattels. So if her husband's wealth was primarily in movable assets, she had no automatic claim to a share of those. Secondly, dower could be circumvented or reduced. A husband could, through clever legal arrangements or a formal jointure, established at the time of marriage, ensure that his wife received a specific income or property in lieu of dower. While a jointure might sometimes be more generous, it removed her automatic right to 1/3 of the land, placing her economic security entirely at her husband's discretion. Furthermore, even with dower, a widow's economic position could be difficult. She was entitled to income from the land, but not to the land itself, and could not sell it or significantly alter it. If the land was heavily burdened with debts or unproductive, her dower income might be meager. She also had no claim to her husband's other assets that were not freehold land. This often meant that while the male heir, typically the eldest son, inherited the bulk of the estate and all its personal property, the widow was left with only a life interest in a fraction of the land, forcing her to rely on the goodwill of her son or other relatives for additional support or access to resources. This disparity often led to tensions within families, particularly if the heir resented the portion of land tied up by his mother's dower. Consider also the situation of her own inherited property. Before marriage, a woman might inherit land or goods from her own family. As discussed under coverture, upon marriage, control over her land passed to her husband, and her personal property became his. If she died before him, any land that she had inherited would typically pass to her own heirs, not necessarily her husband's, but only after his death. Her personal property, however, remained his. If her husband died first, her land would revert to her, and she could regain full control over it, but this was dependent on survivorship. The legal system was designed to ensure that property largely flowed through male lines, and a woman's marriage often served to consolidate her husband's family wealth, rather than ensuring her own independent financial legacy. The custom of courtesy further illustrates the male-centric nature of inheritance. If a wife died, leaving a child born of the marriage, her husband, the courtesy tenant, had a life interest in all of her freehold lands, not just 1/3. This was a much more extensive right than dower, giving the husband full control over all his deceased wife's inherited land for the remainder of his life, provided they had a child born alive. This stark difference in inheritance rights between a husband and a wife after the death of their spouse clearly demonstrated the legal bias towards male control over property and wealth. The inability of a wife to make a will for her own personal property without her husband's permission further compounded her limited control over her legacy. While she might sometimes be allowed to bequeath certain small personal items, any substantial bequests were almost certainly subject to his approval, as the property was legally his. This meant that she could not independently plan for the distribution of her own possessions or provide for specific individuals after her death, unless her husband consented. Her voice in the ultimate disposition of her estate was severely muted. In sum, a wife in 1415 lived under the shadow of a legal system that severely constrained her ability to accumulate, control, or dispose of wealth, particularly for her future security. Economic well-being was inextricably linked to her husband's life and his decisions. Upon his death, she gained some independence, but often with a limited and uncertain financial outlook, reliant on specific legal provisions or the goodwill of her husband's male heirs. This fundamental disadvantage meant that a married woman's economic future was perpetually precarious, a stark testament to the deeply ingrained patriarchal structure of the legal system in 1415.